the difference between essential and accidental complexity. You start to question and realize that all that accidental complexity may not need to actually be there in the first place.
There's a lot of problems where humans are functionally APIs.
If you think about where AI is actually having the most impact today, it's going to be the places where you can actually scope down the problem in such a way that's like tractable today. And this woman, Vicky, gets on and she starts crying tears of joy. Like, we've never seen someone cry from using a B2B SaaS product before. There's parts of the economy where software has eaten the world.
Yeah.
But there's lots of places in the world still where that hasn't happened yet.
Trying to get you on the pod for a little while, Michael. Like, I think you've blowing him out a little bit, but now
I think excited to be here.
Yeah, you've been stealthy in a fun way, and I think from my perspective, in a very
bring the fun back to stealth.
Yeah, in a really respectable like way, and I'm excited to have you on because like now you're really trying to kind of debut Comulate to the public at large, and I think for me it's exciting, tracking your success there, given like you guys have built a very, very interesting like business, and in my eyes, in a place that a lot of folks don't really pay attention to. I think a lot of the work you've been doing in insurance, identifying the problem spaces there, and I think at the end of the day, just like actually the discrete kind of outcomes and palpable impact y'all are like having, or something that I think a lot of folks could like learn like a ton from. So I don't actually want to butcher, the whole Comulate story and whatnot. So I want to kick it over to you to hear, you intro yourself and talk a bit more around like Comulate and your origin story there.
Yeah, totally. Well, really appreciate the kind words, and excited to be on the pod. A little bit about, I can just start with my own background and how I ended up here. Started my career, came across Brex, a 10-person company in a cramped Soma office. And I loved the early team and the vision they had. I joined as an early engineer and saw this incredible trajectory of over 900 people during my time there.
Yeah.
And it felt like watching a company trajectory just on fast forward because of how quickly it was growing.
Yeah. I mean, I was a user in the middle of there at some point. So
it was an amazing product. And then really towards the end of my time there, started thinking more and more about starting a company. And around that time, my longtime friend Jordan, who's an incredible product builder, he was an early PM at Asana, software to IPO. We were good friends from college. Yeah. And built projects together over the years. And it just, the timing felt, the stars aligned. And we said, okay, we want to start a company together. And this was late 2021.
Sure.
Do you remember back to that time? It was like peak VC startup fundraising activity. And the spaces we started out looking at were all the hot ones during that time.
Sure.
Compensation planning software or usage-based billing, fintech APIs. And as we were going through them, we just realized like, there just doesn't seem like there's that much of a problem to solve here, honestly. And yes, you could save someone a few clicks here and there.
Yeah.
But there wasn't that much of a difference. And often they were like 10 or 20 other startups doing pretty similar or the exact same thing. And so after going through a lot of them and coming to the conclusion of like, hey, this just isn't really what's exciting us. Like, we want something with more impact, actually can make a really big difference. And that's when we said, or really started to think about like why that's the case, and realize like a lot of folks at tech are kind of just building for themselves.
Yeah.
And it totally makes sense at an individual level of why you'd solve your own problems. But if you zoom out at a macro level, it leads to this oversaturation in certain markets and categories.
Yeah.
And so we said, okay, we really want to have a unique approach here and step away from that. And so that's what inspired us to kind of go outside of the box and think about, where are the places that software builders are not going.
Sure.
And at that time, the last place they were going was the insurance back office. Yeah. So we started learning more about it. We came across this workflow in insurance where accountants were typing in thousands of spreadsheets and PDFs by hand every single month. It didn't make any sense to us. And so we started putting together an initial product. We ended up getting our first paying customer on it. And a weekend we had this Zoom call to hear it had been going.
Yeah.
And anytime you're building something now new into the world, you're always kind of like nervous about how it's going to be received. So we're like on the edge of our seat as we're, having this catch-up call. And this woman, Vicky, gets on and she starts crying tears of joy from using this product for like a week.
Yeah.
We're like, holy crap. Like we've never seen someone cry from using a B2B SaaS product before. That like doesn't happen every day. And so it was clear to us, like, especially relative to everything we saw in the past, like there's something special here. Like how could you not double down and, continue building there? And that was really the genesis of how what really started to get us sold on like, hey, there's a huge opportunity here.
Totally.
And it doesn't really make sense to us why no one else is paying attention to it, but it makes a lot of sense to us.
Yeah. And, and I think why I like appreciate like the perspective there is like, like I think for us and folks in Silicon Valley, especially, and I think, we coming from like similar, like early, like, tech backgrounds where it's like, we were building tools for folks that are spoiled for choice. It's like, the typical like enterprise buyer at like a big bank or a big software company and whatnot. And it's like, and like, kind of coming, with people's own tunnel vision of like, oh, this is how I think I would solve this problem because I've had it before. But it's such an interesting, I think for, me having gone through a similar process as, my co-founder Antonio and I were building our last company, Silo, in like the agriculture space, which was just like flipping that on its head and being like, wait, like there's so many folks who software has not been democratized to. It's just like they've been really largely ignored by the previous like waves and have just like built a lot of these processes just by necessity, like internally on their own, taping systems together, taping like workflows together with just human labor, like just very.
They had no better choice.
They had no better choice than that, like there. So, to maybe like dig a bit more into the impact that like Comulate provides, would love to kind of get a sense of like, you're presenting this user, she's literally like, tears like just coming down, like. What impact did you have in her life with that? Like what kind of caused that like reaction like there?
Yeah, it was pretty insane to us as well at the time. I think if you really look back at her background, it kind of gives a little bit more context. So for example, like this our first paying customer, Vicky, she'd been doing this job for like 2 or 3 decades. Every month at the end of the month, because she was working in accounting, she'd be having to work like 18 plus hour days. It would like take time away from her family and kids. And a lot of it was just like rote data entry, right? Yeah. And the software that she's using on a day-to-day basis, it's not modern software, right? It's not meant to be optimized for UX or productivity. And so if you asked her, was this problem even solvable? Yeah. Her answer would probably be no. Yeah. Because she would say like, hey, I've seen, attempts at it in the past. They've never worked. Yeah. I've been doing this for 20 plus years and it's still this way. Yeah. Why is it not changing anytime soon?
It's just a hard fact of life for her.
Yeah. Exactly. And so I think from that perspective, it shattered her expectations of even like what's possible. And I mean, to your point earlier around, if you look at the economy and like software penetration, there's parts of the economy where software has eaten the world. Yeah. But there's lots of places in the world still where that hasn't happened yet.
I mean, arguably most. Yeah.
Totally. And I think as software builders, like that's where we find there to just be the most opportunity, the most excitement. It's not that much fun in our eyes to build the umpteenth, note-taking app or something. Yeah. You actually want to build something that wouldn't have existed if you hadn't been the one to actually bring it to life.
Yeah. And turning that around, it's like, it didn't exist, but it drives discrete impact where it's just like, and that's not to say like, we don't need new developer tools. It's not to say we don't need improved, like tooling for enterprise sales teams and stuff like that. But like, like those folks have had enough attention. Like let's spread the love like a little bit and try to like impact folks who, like things like insurance where virtually everyone uses. Like, why aren't we kind of seeing those sea changes like there?
Yeah, totally. And the hard aspect about it too, it's harder to build software for those folks, right? Because, if you're a software engineer in San Francisco, you don't have an intuition about what an accountant in Alabama, working at an insurance agency wants day to day.
No.
It takes a lot of work to understand and empathize with that user. And I think a lot of folks, especially like early on in the product development process, when they're doing, user interviews or learning about, problem area, they kind of expect you can just ask the user, what do you want? And then they can basically, write out the spec for them and they just need to implement it. But you realize actually going through this, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
It's a lot harder and you need to do that work to really, really understand the world to do it yourself.
Yeah. Like one of the, biggest, if not biggest challenge in product thinking is that everyone knows how to complain. Everyone knows how to point out problems and everyone knows what they don't like.
Yeah.
It's really hard to articulate how to solve those problems in really like tractable ways other than just being like, oh, like just take this process that I do manually and just like put that in, like render that as software, like rather than like, I think as us, like both the double-edged sword is that as new kind of viewers into spaces and like folks with that engineering mindset is that we can kind of think through the first principles and like data modeling. I think the double-edged sword there is like overreaching and trying to make too many assumptions. And kind of as you mentioned, it is like really this balance of like empathizing with users' real problems and focusing on like indexing on like kind of more like solutions that they can't articulate and or think about, like that classical, like quote from like, like Ford, where it's just like, people asked for what they wanted. They would ask for faster horses. They would not have asked for like the automobile. And it's being able to kind of index like around that. So early on, like how did y'all manage that? Like building that like gauge, given like, you mentioned, you both had some like background in fintech, so may have like touched maybe a bit more insurance on like that side of things. But how did you just like start, like, let's say kind of drinking the ocean there?
You just have to spend a ton of time with users.
Of course.
I really think there's like no other way around it. Yeah. And especially in that early stage when you're having to ramp up on a lot quite quickly.
Yeah.
Spending a ton of time with their customers, have them walk you through every step of their process. And then in the back of your head, you're thinking, hey, how can I actually like improve this?
Yeah.
That's what I think really gives you the bedrock to like build those 10x better products. That's the part a lot of folks want to skip. It's not particularly interesting. It's not particularly fun many times.
Yes.
But that's what actually resonates with users, right? They're going to recognize that like crazy acronym in their legacy software system that you also know and you can call out as, helping them. That's what's actually going to connect them and have them trust your solution. You know what you're talking about.
Speak their language. Like don't like replace it, but like empower them, speak it, and like, just understand where they're coming from.
For sure.
Yeah. Well, before digging a bit more into, how you've built like a team to really, I think, live up to this culture and like continue like extending it. And then you have something to announce that I'd love to kind of make the room for you.
Well, we recently announced our Series B, which we're super excited about. And I know we were talking about this right before this, though. There's kind of an overemphasis at times of like the fundraising journey over the company building journey. And so, it's a huge achievement for us, but we think much more so in terms of the actual milestones of building a company and building a product that delivers value for customers. To give a little bit of backstory on our trajectory here, we raised a seed round a few years ago, and the company hit profitability pretty quickly afterwards. And we went heads down into building mode, and we're growing quite quickly. And when people would hear about that growth, their instinctual question would be, when's the Series A?
Yeah.
When is it coming, right?
Yeah.
And to us, it was just kind of a strange question.
It's just like, well, we already built a healthy business. Like, why do we need capital? Yeah.
Exactly. And at that time, capital wasn't the constraint.
Exactly.
Right? It was like, hey, we need to really build a product. We need to get more customers, hire the team. And so also because the company was profitable, there wasn't really a strong need to. And so for us, we've always just intrinsically been driven and, that's what we more so measure ourselves towards around, where I think there's more of a theme sometimes in the startup ecosystem to measure yourself in terms of these like discrete fundraising milestones. We think about it much more so of like actually building a product, delivering value to customers, right?
Product market fit, and then being able to like really demonstrate those real world outcomes that are like happening and driving value, and ideally like, growing business and revenue for your end users, which obviously everyone wins and trickles to you.
Yeah, totally. And so it was really only until recently that when we were taking a step back and realized the larger opportunity, it made sense now to raise more capital.
Yeah.
And we were in a fortunate position where we didn't necessarily need to.
Sure.
We could be fairly selective about who we brought on and found some amazing partners in Bond and Workday Ventures that we're now working with on bringing this to life. And now we're at the phase where we're back to building mode, heads down. And it's a really exciting time, especially with some of the topics we were talking about around just like the opportunity in front of us, especially with AI.
Sure.
And now ready to hit the pedal to the metal.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I think I really appreciate that philosophy around raising to grow. I think that's really the primary and only way that I like to think about it. Whereas like, the only reason you need to, take on that outside capital is that like, as you mentioned, kind of the blocker to achieving what more you need to do. And, it's exciting to like hear that y'all have answered so many of those early company building questions, like early on. Like there is that strong pull of product market fit. You have like identified, and like not only like a deep ICP, but something that is so sizable that like you guys want to accelerate. You want to hit the gas pedal and attack it even faster. And I think a big part of that, which, you've been alluding to this time, is talent. And, and I think something that's always stood out to me about Comulate is, especially as you were mentioning this, user empathy, bringing, an outsider's lens, but then also in a really respectful and understanding way to attacking your customer problems. Like, that's something that, my co-founder and Tony and myself obsess over, and something that, we, did pretty deeply at our last company, like, even flying out our engineers to, the farms and like warehouses that a lot of our users from coming from, like, and them really incorporating and ensuring every engineer speaks to our customers, like that they're involved on onboardings, they're seeing like user like feedback very discreetly. Would love to dig into on like the talent side of things. Like, you've been able to keep your team extremely like efficient in a lot of different metrics there. So want to kind of dig into how you thought of that structure and how you've been able to enable your team to do so much there.
Yeah, totally. It's something we think a lot about and something we talk a lot about internally about is this concept of collapsing the talent stack.
Yeah.
And I didn't come up with the term. All credit goes to Scott Belsky, who did. And the idea is basically if you have someone that can morph into adjacent roles, you have like an engineer that can talk to a customer like a PM or a data scientist that can implement their idea and take it to production.
Sure.
That person can just operate way, way more effectively, right?
Of course.
Because they don't need to talk to 3 different people to solve a problem and execute on something. They can do it all themselves. They'd actually do it fairly well in the process. And so we think a lot about how can we empower people to do that and like find their own abilities and ways to do so. So for example, we have a data scientist on our team, and they've been using Cursor to understand and actually navigate the code base a lot more quickly. And now they're able to implement their ideas like 80 or 90% of the way there to production, and they don't actually need a product engineer to do that.
Yeah.
Themselves. And so, especially with like AI tools now, that's like a big wave of
Yeah.
it's just making that concept of collapse to the talent stack, I think, even easier, which is really exciting.
Mhm.
And if you can, this is what we were talking about earlier, there's this natural communication cost, the game of telephone
Of course.
that everyone in a company,
Yeah.
more than like 10 or 20 people has played. You could just completely or largely eliminate that from your company operating.
And I think like, I mean, just to kind of jump off of that, like last point, I think a lot of folks like don't realize how much inertia, not only in kind of growing your team out, but growing your team out really quickly does, and how taxing it is on you as like an organization where, you know, when you are more nimble and light on your feet, like everyone is a little more naturally on the same page by default. And you also like have more space to develop these like communication patterns. And, you know, as you judiciously add more people, you know, quite frankly, people are just going to copy what they see. When they join an organization, like that's the default that most folks fall into. So being able to like have those strong communication and decision-making patterns that can kind of scale as you go on, like there, I think is really like powerful, as well as, you know, as you were mentioning, like, you know, with AI, it makes folks in a sense just stronger generalists across the board. And I think, you know, I'll speak for myself. That's something that is so critical for, you know, the early stage of product building is like having folks who are Swiss Army knives. Like it doesn't matter that they're like a data scientist, that their whole world is, you know, R or MATLAB. Is like, you know, if they're sharp, they'll be able to like fill in the gaps and kind of figure things out. And then when you empower them with a tool like the Cursors of the world, they're better able to understand very quickly the context that they're missing. Like, you know, they don't have to ask a question n times in Slack. They can like strangely, like, you know, self-serve them like selves and kind of get like across the board like there. And I mean, because so much, I think the irony is so much of work and even code is communication and understanding. And now we have tools to even amplify and like accelerate that much faster and empower folks, where it's like, who cares if, you know, it's a GTM person and like and they need to like, you know, help kind of iterate on like the UI side of things, or like, you know, a backend engineer who's like, I need to update this, you know, this data model to like empower, like, you know, like our data scientist there is like, doesn't really matter what your role is. It's being able to like, you know, empower folks and kind of build that culture of like, let's just drive outcomes. It doesn't matter that this is your fiefdom. Yo, you're the MLE, like you control the ML stack. Like, oh, you're the go-to-market person. Like, you're the only person who has a say on the landing page. It's like, it really is that team dynamic and mindset there that is just tough to, I wouldn't say it's necessarily like tough to scale if you do it judiciously. It is tough when you like push for like, let's say, hyper growth when it comes to like your employee count or whatnot. But
totally. Yeah, there's that great phase from Facebook, right? Of nothing is someone else's problem.
Exactly.
And this whole concept just makes that easier and easier to actually implement.
A lot of folks in insurance are kind of coming from, oh, this is my process. We've been doing it like this for like so like long. And like, especially if they're coming from legacy software providers and stuff like that, then it's like, oh, well, they do it exactly this way. And this is something that, as we were developing an ERP system for agriculture at our last company, we hit constantly where it's like there were these systems that maybe had a 30, 40 year start on us that were, you know, on-prem systems, or like, you know, something that maybe SAP implemented 30 years ago. And like, you know, our prospects would be like, oh, but they do it this way, or they use like this verbiage, and like not being able to like, you know, flip that around and like figure out where we could drive net new value, or even make a lot of those points like move from a first principles like approach. Would love to like hear your perspective there, and like how you and your team have either fallen into those traps or avoided those traps and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a good question. And like you get that all the time starting out, which is, it's like these surface level feature requests that are more so driven by like the trappings, kind of like vestiges of whatever the past was, instead of, even if those things aren't really necessary in like the new world you're trying to build towards. And it makes sense because someone's just used to doing something for a long time.
Sure.
and you're changing a lot of that for them. I think the way we thought about it is, one, if you have that really deep user understanding, you're able to confidently say to them, hey, you actually won't need that in this world. And your world's going to be a lot better as a result. And then you can actually make a strong case for saying, hey, we're going to help you get to that end state. And you might not even need that keyboard shortcut or that step anymore, because we're going to be completely, replacing it with something else. And so I think if you're able to kind of build that trust with users, it gives you sort of legitimacy to be able to say that, and people actually trust you when you do. At least that's what we found to be the best in that situation.
Yeah. And I think that works really well with the next set of topics I wanted to dig into, which is managing complexity. When you're diving into these industries that have just had so much gunk piled up on them. It's just there's a lot of business process they take for granted. And it's this is just the way to do things. And, out of that culture, very complex, ontologies that do form, you try to kind of map to their data models or things that they've, resources that they work through. And it isn't really quite, it doesn't mesh well when, it comes from folks like us who think through first principles, abstraction layers, building the necessary interfaces to interact with those. So would love to hear your perspective on managing that complexity. How do you attack that, reduce that, de-risk that? Insurance itself is such a real world and complex business. So I'm really curious to hear.
Yeah. So something we talk a lot about internally is this concept of taming complexity. And there's this concept from Fred Brooks, this programming legend that I love, which is the difference between essential and accidental complexity. And the gist is that essential complexity is this mandatory, irreducible complexity to solve a problem at hand. And then accidental complexity is everything else. And so if you think about, for example, building a house, the essential complexity is the raw materials that go into it, the wood, the bricks, actually assembling it together. And then the accidental complexity is you have to get a permit, you have to find a contractor, you have to make sure the contractor's not going to screw you over. It's all this other stuff that goes into it. But some of it, it makes sense as well, it's there, but it's not truly necessary for the task at hand. And so kind of the point you were bringing up earlier, in these real world systems over time, there's just this natural buildup of accidental complexity.
It feels like slack on your teeth. It just kind of piles up, and it's very unchecked, just given how, it's unchecked because folks didn't have the tools to actually understand and observe those processes. They're just stuck doing them manually. It's just their job every day.
Right.
How can you zoom out when you're manually aggregating all these pieces, which I think funny enough has been a great realization we've had from our users kind of leveraging them, where it's a lot of these folks and a lot of these folks are just technology companies themselves. And an assumption that fell flat for Antonio and myself really quickly is especially with our early ICP at Beb being, software engineers, and pretty, poised and modern product and engineering and operations teams. And we'd be they completely understand the ontology of the data. They know exactly what they need to transform. And that's something where that fell flat very quickly. Even with our first customer deployment, it's when we started onboarding them and they didn't really have any gauge of their process when it came to tracking shipments throughout their supply chain, because they were just bombarded by emails. And they initially had this issue that they thought they had with their data, where they're oh, actually for given invoices, we think the shipments are actually spread across multiple emails. So they're oh, we definitely need you to help us actually correlate across different inputs into the same underlying resource we have in our system, because that was just the complexity they just kind of imagined they were used to. That was just that's the day to day. We feel when we just have our teams mainly doing this, it's it's something that we know is there.
Gut feel.
Yeah, that feel. It was a gut feel.
Right.
Then they started processing I mean, up to this point, it's like millions of data points like through us. And they came back to us and they were like, actually, all those data quality issues, like we were completely wrong about where we were lacking quality. It's like, actually, most of these shipments are pretty well sequestered into like a single communication or a single thread. We actually have a lot more issues like mapping those like pieces like described in the emails to our internal catalogs and our internal like resource. So it actually kind of inverted the problem, that the space they were coming from. And they were just like, it was crazy because they just accepted that as like a very, just like as a truth. That was just an assumption that like an operating assumption they continued to make. And like now they're kind of shaken up in a good way a little bit and be like, we actually are coming to grips with this.
Yeah, and it's not until you actually look at things from first principles that you start to question and realize that all that accidental complexity may not need to actually be there in the first place. And so that's something we think a lot about when building software, because the challenge is, or the trap you can fall into is the status quo. It has all this accidental complexity that's built up over time. And if your approach is just to take the status quo and put it into a web app, it's going to come with all this like baggage of that accidental complexity. It's not actually going to be a better product experience really, because it's coming along with all that. And so again, if you really take that time to do the legwork of like understand the user empathy, then you can start to think about a question, hey, what if that complexity is accidental versus essential, right? Which of these steps doesn't really need to exist anywhere? Can we actually automate it? Can we slot it in with this other part? Can we rethink this flow entirely? And when you do that, your exercise, you often are just like simplifying the process a ton. And so then if that's what you put into your software product, right? The result is that the experience is just a lot simpler. And that's when you have this like experience when someone's using it, like, holy crap, like it gets me. And I didn't even think that it could be solved this way, but it makes sense.
I think that segues like really well into what I want to start kind of digging into a bit more, given there's a lot of hypotheses thrown around about this, but really AI and vertical SaaS. Like I think like being through this rodeo before, there was FinTech and vertical SaaS, and that was like the last like real big like kind of cycle of hype, and like, you know, and for good reason. There was things that like work well there, but you know, now it's like, oh, like AI is eating software, like, you know, like, or like AI is like now it's starting to kind of start attacking verticals and like vertical SaaS. And like I definitely have a very strong opinion here around how user interfaces can and should change. I mean, that's I am biased because that's a huge part of why we're building BEM and the product like here. But I want to hear from your perspective about like, at least like when it comes to kind of the surface level, like narrative being pushed about AI, like what are folks getting wrong about AI and vertical SaaS? And, you know, from your perspective, and would love to also dig into maybe a bit more concretely what y'all have done at Comulate to empower your users through AI. Like, what, you know, there's many right ways to do it, but what is your kind of unique insight there? And what do you think has been the most powerful thing from a product perspective for you?
It's a really exciting place to be, I think, right now with vertical SaaS and AI, because it's just opening so many doors that you can go down that weren't openable before. On why I think that is a trend in the first place right now, if you kind of take a step back and think about you know, the difference between like horizontal and vertical problems. If you were to try to build, you know, let's say a product that tries to automate a business process for like every company on earth. You know, like let's say accounts receivable, like a common business process like that. And you try to fully automate it, even with AI today, it's going to be really, really difficult. Just because there's so much variation, right? Like the 1 million person company and, you know, Germany has way, way different needs than, you know, the mom and pop shop like down the street. And as a result, there's just going to be, it just makes the difficulty of that task is just a lot more difficult. Whereas if you actually scope it down and say, hey, can we fully automate, you know, accounts receivable for law firms of 1 to 500 people that use QuickBooks or something today. That's actually much more like tractable problem, right? And so if you think about where AI is actually having the most impact today, it's not going to be these really pie in the sky, extremely complex problem spaces yet.
Yeah.
It's going to be the places where you can actually scope down the problem in such a way that's like tractable today.
You're really hitting the nail on the head there. And I think like one class of problems that's very tractable that I think you were like alluding to in some ways is like, there's so many tasks where like, because we had the wrong abstractions or because software, let's say, was unevenly deployed and has been maintained, where it's like, there's a lot of problems where humans are functionally APIs between systems of record or like between different workflows and like pieces like that, given like, while even a lot of that data may be digitized or is digitizable, there was no clear way to tie that together or to kind of build your way out of that was a huge amount of kind of complexity like there, like previously. And, obviously there's like a whole, set of like tasks there. Like I think, we're getting, I think data entry has always been something that folks have tried to kind of abstract away through software. I think we're finally getting to that point. I think it's like, it's funny to me that people are still kind of falling back on RPA, given that's functionally, you're just still taking a human user interface and like applying, just the same kind of actions. Like
A lot of that accidental complexity,
yeah,
right?
and accidental complexity. Like I think that's like kind of the big, funny, like I don't want to say mistake, but it's like a trap that we're falling, a lot of people are kind of falling back into again. Like, I mean, it's something that you'll hear Antonio and I say repeatedly, especially on this podcast, is that, especially with a lot of the ways that AI agents are formed, they're exceptionally great at helping an individual and empowering them. Like you look at, co-pilots, you look at a lot of these agents that help do like tasks like I think AR and billing management for like a single like person or something like that. But then when you kind of zoom out and you try to attack like industries or process where it's like these run millions of times a day. This isn't just an individual. This is like actually abstracting away and also like, maybe using a necessarily stochastic system to apply to a kind of complex from a data side, complex like problem from that, but for like a human is very like, let's say straightforward as like a rote task there. So, I think that was a long-winded way of getting to like, how do you guys kind of envision incorporating product experiences like that, where it's like you're subtly or not so subtly empowering your users, you're kind of making them have a lot more of those magic like moments and you, are just kind of driving very clear like value today for them.
Yeah, I think the way we think about it, as you were talking about, it's like giving this individual superpowers.
Yeah.
Right. So I was talking about like Vicky earlier on, and now Vicky can do, 100x the volume of what she was doing previously, because she's not like literally typing the stuff in by hand anymore, right?
Yeah.
She's more so acting as like a more strategic angle of like moving things around and only working, exceptions and whatnot.
Yeah, she has like
doesn't have to do
leveraging her expertise a lot more around than just banging her head against the keyboard. Like she's able to, I'm sure, identify a lot more things faster and ideally just take on a ton more business like too.
Yeah, totally. And I think that approach in AI systems works a lot better in general than trying to completely automate the solution.
Yeah.
Especially if you're working in these, these spaces where you can't mess up.
No.
And for example, we primarily work with finance and accounting, and you can't write bad data to a general ledger, right? And so if you were to take this approach or say, hey, we need to 100%, without any human impact or intervention at all, automate this, it'd just be way more difficult.
Yeah.
And you very, very likely would not be able to get away with actually, not doing harm basically in the process.
Yeah. I don't know if you've been able to take a look at this, but this is like a white paper that our team really kind of holds to high regard very internally. Sierra, like, one of the more prominent like agent startups, like let's say kind of working in like the customer service space and has had some like successes like there, especially in a really large enterprise, like has a white paper they put out called Tau Bench, which is functionally like an evaluation framework for agents, where if you have a completely stochastic agent that orchestrates itself, does its own tool selection, it understands like, like APIs and like a data model as well, which in their kind of evaluation example, they actually used airline booking. Like they actually used a pretty straightforward like customer service type use case where it's like, you could use like an agent just to chat with it, book a flight. Obviously it's like aware the agent itself is where the API has built its own tools to do tool selection around that, as well as like, being able to like search a database. Text to SQL is like yet another one of those like libs are so good at it, and they're just like, yeah, like let's like evaluate this. Even with state of the art, when they like GPT-4, Claude 3.5 Sonnet, like basic tasks like book a flight, check status, like blah blah. If you completely introduced purely stochastic components in there, it was accurate less than half the time. It was like I think 43 some percent. Obviously not being exact there, but it was like pretty low even for like the big models. And now that folks are now wrapping these big models and more reasoning changes, which kind of mimics even still that agentic flow, but yet leaves a lot to be desired there, and like throwing kind of more and more stochasticity and like lower probabilities actually solving the end goal like there, which I think really like touches on that point you just made, where it's like if you're trying to automate the whole process where there's multiple layers of, let's say, approvals, checks, there's also a lot of like more discrete kind of reasoning steps that cascade and like impact each other. From a product experience perspective, how have you guys avoided a lot of that, given like, you guys have provided your users really clear superpowers and like are speeding up their processes so effectively? What's your kind of lens on that, and especially like introducing these new components into your product stack?
Yeah, and I think people don't want that product experience in many cases. They much more so want to feel like they have those superpowers.
Yeah,
and they want to feel like they're in control.
exactly.
And giving them a product experience where it's like, hey, yeah, you don't have to type in this thing, but you can just drag it in and it'll do it for you.
Yeah.
But you can still review the output. You can still preview it before you click that button that writes it to whatever system you're integrating with. That I think is like we've just found to be the much more amenable product experience and what people are actually looking for.
Totally.
As opposed to, hey, I'm going to go off to the beach for the day and I just want this thing to completely do the job for me.
Yeah, and give me a ring when it's done,
Right,
like, yeah. So would love to like maybe talk a bit more in particular. Like I know you were able to share a bit of a blog post that may, by the time of this podcast being out, maybe out at that point, but kind of digging a little bit more deeply into one of your engineers and how they like approach like solving this like very kind of discrete kind of AI, or not AI, but like data kind of like unstructured data management problem, but then being able to kind of build from first principles, like a system that not only continues to kind of improve upon itself, but like actually like is a discrete superpower that it is offering your users. So would love to kind of hear you put a bit more kind of color like there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's a really interesting example of just a big lesson we've learned in applying these AI systems in the real world, that if it's to the point we were talking about earlier too, if you're able to combine that business domain understanding with understanding what the state of the art is, that's really like where the magic happens.
Sure.
And so this blog post that Gavin put out, an engineer on our team, is a really good example of that. So he was working on a new product feature where, as part of it, we need to extract out structured data from invoices. Yeah. Classic like document analysis problem, right? And
I'm too familiar.
and as part of it, we were looking through it, and the formats are all over the place. Yeah. There's like a ton of ambiguity of like even what the right answer is oftentimes.
Yeah.
We were trying out all of these standard prompt engineering tactics that honestly weren't working that well.
Yeah.
And so what we came across that interestingly did work well was that if you gave the model a few example inputs and outputs and asked it, hey, can you create a prompt that actually would extract these outputs, given this input? It was very, very accurate and high signal.
Yeah.
The challenge though is that it only worked well if you did that for the same format again and again.
Sure.
Right. And so then the question becomes, okay, but how would you partition these formats of invoices?
Yeah.
They're like these arbitrary PDFs. Like, what even is a format? It becomes this really complex problem.
Of course.
And so that's when Gavin saw, just by understanding the problem really deeply, wait a second, these are invoices.
Yeah.
And they all have bank account information because they're trying to get paid for these invoices.
Of course.
And if you actually look at those, I use those as identifiers, that actually serves as like a really high signal way that you can partition these into like distinct formats. And getting those identifiers doesn't even require an LLM, right? It's not some like crazy stochastic process. There's actually like heuristics you can use that are really, really high signal to do on its own.
Yeah.
And so we were able to basically combine that pretty simple like business domain understanding insight with this prompt LLM engineering tactic.
Yeah.
And that's what actually enabled us to get this like 10x better accuracy over anything we had before.
How did your users witness that? Like, how did they?
They have no idea.
That's awesome. So it's like, have they like, I love like product releases like that. Have they noticed like that there's better outcomes happening? Have they mentioned that to you? Like, or have you been measuring that? Like from your end, is it like, let's say less support tickets coming through for y'all being like, oh, why did this happen? Is it like, you mentioned like, there's part of your product experience where they could see like how the data was like pulled. Like, is it like, are you tracking like less diffs from like the edits that they're making? Like, I'm curious like there.
I mean, the biggest thing for applying this in the real world that everyone is talking about right now is evals.
Yeah.
Like that's what you need to have
of course
objective measurements of, is this actually performing?
Yeah.
And so that's really what we hold ourselves to. And that's where we see the objective experience. But you're totally right. I think that's why it's a pretty exciting time. And a lot of the products we use every day too, they're just getting better and better.
Yeah.
And users, there's no exactly like new product release that needs to happen.
Yeah.
It's just you're noticing it as you're in, Google Docs like day to day or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think like it's funny because like that's how a lot of our users have been kind of baking us in as well, where it's like all of a sudden for their end users or folks using their platforms, they're just like, oh, wait, like now I don't even have to approve this anymore. Just send it straight through. Like it's just like they stop having to kind of put those humans in a loop. And I think the interesting thing is like us now being able to build that iterative trust. Like I think rather than try to sell folks and over automate something or promise them some sense of accuracy that we can't because we don't actually know their data, it's like actually kind of building these loops and like, as you're mentioning, like evals are like king, the ability to like actually trace these pieces over time, have that confidence when you do deploy. And then the end user just like, it just keeps getting mad.
Rewards.
It just works.
Yeah.
It just works. Like, and I think that's like the best feedback that I love receiving, especially, for, in a similar but different way, like building mission critical software for folks who need to rely on it every day, where it's like the best compliment you can get is like I forgot about it because it just works so well. I just like rely on it by default. It's just like, now this is my, like, we were talking about all these cultural mores and process that guilt, but it's like, then you become that default process where it's like, oh, I don't question it. It's just working. It's just that like smooth. And like, for me, that's like really the platonic ideal for like building a lot of the kinds of software that we're kind of tackling there. But to wrap up, I know you had some kind of things to like announce or like talk through. So yeah, I want to keep the floor open for you there.
It's an exciting time right now. I mean, we were talking before, there's this huge opportunity, ahead of us in what we're building around just automating the insurance back office and augmenting this world that has been just like untouched by modern software so far.
Yeah.
And especially with the advent of AI, we're just seeing this on like a week by week basis. It's like, holy crap, this problem that just wasn't solvable in the past now is, you know? And so a big part of, especially why we're raising the Series B and taking things to the next level is just building out our team.
Of course.
And so we're making a big push right now to expand the team, recruiting all-star folks from engineering, business, sales, and more.
Awesome.
So you can find us online, comulate.com/careers. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, they've got some cool videos on the site, so check it out too. I'm a fan of it. So yeah.
Awesome.
Well, thanks again for coming by.
Of course. Thanks for having me.